Today's episode of Between the Covers is brought to you by the Summer Writing Program at Naropa University. Since 1974, the Summer Writing Program has been a wild and inspiring combination of writing school, counterculture event, and literary festival. And this summer marks the 51st Summer Writing Program. The title theme for SWP 2025 is The Living Thread, to signal a recommitment to the collective study of writing as an art, spiritual practice, and agitating force for social change, the living thread extending for another half-century. Some of this year's faculty and guests include Anne Waldman, C.A. Conrad, Safa Fati, Elizabeth Willis, Cody Rose Clevedens, Eleni Sikelianos, Edwin Torres, Cedar Saigo, Pupe Misagi, Farid Matuk, Pragita Sharma, Joshua Beckman, Tongo Eisen Martin, Valerie Shong, Julian Talamontes Berlasky, and others. As part of a contemplative education project and an experiment in community, the Summer Writing Program does not engage in gatekeeping, and nearly all writers, artists, and interested or curious students are welcome to register. There is no application fee. And while the window for 2025 scholarships has already passed, a robust and diverse slate of scholarships is awarded annually to support students from across the globe. For more information, please visit the online catalog at naropa.edu/SWP. Today's episode is also brought to you by Sour Cherry, the much-anticipated debut novel by Natalia Teodoridou that is being called a diamond work by Morgan Talty. A stunning reimagining of Bluebeard, one of the most mythologized serial killers, but twisted into a modern tale of toxic masculinity, a feminist sermon, and a folk tale for the 21st century. Rory Power calls Sour Cherry a folk tale, a whisper, and a dream all at once. Benjamin Percy calls Natalia Teodoridou among the likes of Kelly Link, Angela Carter, and Carmen Maria Machado, claiming that fans of their work will find a new favorite author in Teodoridou. Timely, urgent, and beautifully written, Sour Cherry invites readers to confront age-old systems of gender and power, long-held excuses made for bad men, and the complicated reasons we stay captive to the monsters we love. Sour Cherry is available now from Tin House. Today's conversation with poet Patrycja Humienik is about a book called We Contain Landscapes. And of course, we'll explore what this title means as part of the conversation. A conversation that itself, I think, contains landscapes that feels unusually capacious, generous, and generative. What does it mean to risk rupture for rapture, both on the page and in our lives? To honor what we've inherited without being trapped in inherited forms. To love a culture but not a nation. To look to water as method, mode, or muse. To write across boundaries, borders, containers, and norms, whether of family or womanhood or sexuality or religion. Because Poland and Polish poetry are both significant elements in this book, I'll mention two Polish-specific past contributions to the bonus audio archive. When J. Chakrabarty was a guest, he read two poems by the Polish poet, translator, and biographer Bruno Schulz, Jerzy Fikowski. Similarly, past guest Ayad Akhtar, who in his 20s moved to Italy to study with the famed Polish theater director and theorist Jerzy Grotowski, who himself was a former student of the Armenian mystic Gurdjieff. Akhtar reads for us one of Grotowski's last published pieces called Performer and discusses it. This joins, among many other things, a late-night whispered reading by Banu Kapil from her notebooks, Dinez Smith reading poetry from each of the fellow poets in their writing collective, and after each poem devising a poetry writing prompt just for us, and Tori Peters reading the first thing she wrote after transitioning, a zine called How to Become a Really, Really Not Famous Trans Lady Writer, which she reads for us in its entirety, all 20 steps. Subscribing to the bonus audio is only one possible thing to choose from. when you join the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with every conversation of things I discovered while preparing for the conversation, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. And then there's a whirlwind of other things to choose from. Access to the bonus audio, the Tin House Early Reader subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, or a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's episode with Patrycja Humienik. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer, editor, interdisciplinary performance artist, and embodied facilitator, Patrycja Humienik. She has a BA in creative writing and a certificate in peace and conflict studies from the University of Colorado Boulder, a Spanish-English translation certificate from Western Michigan University, an MA in communication from University of Colorado Denver, and is currently an MFA candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Humienik has a past in interdisciplinary theater, or collaboration across mediums in live performance, collaborating with everyone from Dances for Solidarity to Language of Fish Collective Arts. She has also done site-specific performances and workshops in California, Colorado, and Washington. She's offered somatic approaches and creative workshop design to nonprofit, government, arts, and business organizations, including Arts and Literature Laboratory, Northwest Film Forum, and in prisons. And she was an events director and is an editor for the Community Anthologies Project at the Seventh Wave. As a writer, Patrycja Humienik has received fellowships from the Jack Straw Writing Program and Brooklyn Poets, and was a semifinalist for the 2021 92nd Street Y Poetry Discovery Prize. Her poetry has been published widely, from The New Yorker to The Atlantic, from Ninth Letter to Poetry Northwest. She's here today to talk about her debut poetry collection out from Tin House, called We Contain Landscapes. Past Between the Covers guest Aria Aber says of this book, Patrycja Humienik picks up where the great Polish poets of the 20th century left off, writing of exile, war, fragmented families, and grief for a ruined environment. And yet, her mind is utterly contemporary and new, searching and witty, always striving towards a politics of solidarity with the other, the reader, the ancestors, the daughters of immigrants. The poet's wondrous imagination flows like water across these pages, picking up the peculiar and astonishing facts of life on Earth. We Contain Landscapes introduces a gorgeous, determined, and vibrant new voice to American poetry, a voice that dances with, exults in, and blurs the boundaries of the lyric. Poet Joanna Klink adds, daughter of immigrants, Patrycja Humienik confronts the agonizing betrayals of nation-states, as well as the pressures of sexuality, the obliterating lure of the internet. She writes with a physicality that is utterly mesmerizing. Shot through with radiance and self-possession, Humienik's poems are reminders that life at the edge of exorbitant longing can feel more free, more alive. Finally, Matt Sutherland for Forward Reviews says, neuroscientists speculate that humans might have 30 or more senses, and we speculate that Patrycja Humienik's acute sense of longing for a place that no longer exists on a map affects the way she perceives all the others. She is an immigrant daughter fielding questions from generations of ancestors, and this debut collection answers affirmatively, I hear you. Welcome to Between the Covers, Patrycja Humienik.
Thank you so much, David. What a generous intro. Such a pleasure to get to chat with you.
So given that this is your first book, your debut, and given that I have a question for you from another about its arrival and the elements and circumstances that went into us having this book to hold today, and given that this question from another is from someone of great importance to you, I'm going to hand over the first question to past Between the Covers guest, the poet Gabrielle Bates, or as she refers to herself in her question, your art wife. People sometimes hear me marvel at the arbitrariness of awards and accolades when it comes to art and art making. I often bring up Rosemary Waldrop's Nick of Time and Nikki Finney's Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry as books that mean a lot to me, that seem like particularly significant arrivals of poetry and that continue to work on me. And yet, if awards were any indicator, and to be clear, I don't think that they are, you'd never really know that these books came and went. And I feel the same about Gabby's debut collection, Judas Goat, which is in the trophy case inside my heart. Nicole Seeley said of Judas Goat, quote, "In disbelief, you'll want to pinch yourself while reading. No need. Believe me, Judas Goat is just that good." Here's a question for you from Gabby.
Patrycja, beloved art wife, I've been thinking lately about the many returnings in and around your stunning debut collection, We Contain Landscapes. You completed the book having recently returned to the Midwest, the region of your birth and youth, after living elsewhere for many years. The book entered its production phase the summer you returned to Poland for the first time in a decade, if I'm remembering that correctly. And you started writing toward the collection initially in Seattle, where we met and where you returned more fully to poetry after years of focusing the majority of your mind, time, and energy in other directions. There is a poem in the shape of a spiral in your book, the language traveling inward, which I love as a symbol of returning, orbiting the same nucleus from different vantages, approaching. I've been thinking a lot too about your recent return to school and how so much of this book is a testament to the learning, mentorship, and artistic community you were able to find, collaborate with, and co-create with outside of academic institutions before returning to school to study in an MFA program. As poets, we often turn to poetry to grapple with our messiest, most inarticulate questions and feelings. And then when a book comes out, we're expected to be able to talk about the book's terrain in an articulate way outside of the poems, as if the poems themselves haven't already divulged everything we felt willing and capable of articulating. So this is a question less about the book's material and more about your pursuit of learning and rigorous artistic community as you worked towards the book. How did you go about it? And what were some meaningful stepping stones along the way, which emboldened, energized, or otherwise impacted We Contain Landscapes as it was being written? I think many listeners, whether they're in academia in some form or not, whether they have MFAs or not, will find meaningful lessons in the spirit of your particular approach. Thank you so much, David, for your brilliance and care always, and for inviting me to ask a question. Patrycja and I send voice notes to each other every day, multiple times a day. So recording this feels at once very normal and very unnatural, like brushing my teeth behind a podium or something.
Wow, what a delight to start the interview here. As Gabby mentioned, we're in touch daily. How lucky. And in her question, in talking about those stones and essential forces that help shape this book, I mean, she's a huge part of that. I think about my return, as she mentioned, to deepening in poetry and moving to Seattle. I had the charmed experience of moving to a place that was really close to Open Books, a poem emporium in Seattle. And prior to moving there, I was so excited to live near a poetry bookstore. I'd had the pleasure of working at Innisfree back when it still existed in Colorado. And that was another, looking back, part of this spiraling route prior to living in Seattle. Years before that, had worked at the cafe and bookstore, the all poetry bookstore. So when I knew I was going to be living next to another rare poetry bookstore, I was so thrilled, and really shortly after moving to Seattle, went to an event. And I remember hearing there was a lovely lineup of readers, and Quentin Baker was one of them, who also released an incredible book in recent years. And I remember he cited Fred Moten before he even started reading. And I had just, the year prior to that in Colorado, had seen Moten at Naropa. I just really had this sense that I was exactly where I needed to be that night. And I met Gabby that night at Open Books, and she bought Inger Christensen's Alphabet for me. It was this really, like, before we even knew each other's names, of this really charmed moment of her overhearing me talking about the book. And she was like, "Can I get that for you?" We just had this wild, charmed beginning to our friendship in poems. And I remember going back home and voraciously reading Alphabet. This was a time for me when I wasn't reading a lot of contemporary poetry books all the way through. And even though this beginning goes so much further back to childhood and to a love of poetry, that this journey of this book really started so much earlier. I think about that moment in Seattle as this returning, as Gabby mentioned, and this acknowledgement of it as being so relational for me. And fast forwarding through our beautiful friendship and having a writing group with other brilliant writers, Erin Lynch and Erin McCoy, who also, Erin's incredible Removal Act came out recently. Erin McCoy has a book coming out soon. We all got to be with each other week after week in deep study, just workshopping poems for years. It was actually over 2 years that we met pretty much every week, including on Zoom once the pandemic hit. And so that kind of study alongside other writers, when I didn't at the time, when I was working full time and just craving writing being a richer part of my life, it really happened with other poets and through voracious reading and learning that there's this whole world of contemporary poetry that I had been longing to connect to and had done some study of. In undergrad, I did study creative writing, so I had some exposure to it, but a lot of my poetry loves were poets that had passed on at that point. And so, so much to say about the journey, but that's one piece of it, has been friendship and study outside of institutions in that sort of like Moten and Harney way of like the undercommons, the finding the places on the margins to talk about poems together at a time when I was just hungering for more learning. I mean, honestly, this show, various podcasts, so many things were a part of that growth, just listening to writers talking about their work. And so building this book came out of that, and being nudged to think about individual poems I was writing and the sort of orchestra they might be a part of. I have a memory too of the poet Adrian Matika, who visited a class I took in undergrad, and we stayed in loose contact over the years, and he sort of witnessed me from afar in this turning away from poetry and returning back to it. And when I was in Seattle, starting to more actively write again. he asked that of me, of a few individual poems. He was like, I want to know about the cousins to these poems. He was sort of nudging me to think in this larger way. And I was so intimidated around the idea of making a book. And so the book is indebted to those relationships, the questions asked together, the study together, that appetite. And further, just really thinking about the arts background that I have and letting that be an asset to the poems, like thinking about dance and the body and realizing that in bringing and having workshops and bringing my questions about words that I still don't have a single answer to, like the question of devotion, for example. It felt like this secret hack that I could bring that into a workshop full of other writers, thinkers, artists, and unpack that word together, and then have more poems emerge from that and have a book start growing from that deeper looking at a single word. So that is some of the journey that eventually then brought me to letting this book write me into a new life by coming back to the region of my childhood, as Gabby mentioned, and now studying and writing toward other books in this program.
Well, I love how Gabby's question enacts the title, We Contain Landscapes, how as the book is coming together over time, she notes your return to Poland, your return to the Midwest, the place of your childhood, to pursue your MFA, your life in Seattle, all contained explicitly or not within the pages in some way. But while we're talking about the pre-book phase, I wanted to ask you something about her question about learning. Because if I remember correctly, sometime in late 2023, I had reached out to Elisa Ogi, the poetry editor at Tin House, just to puzzle out some of my own scheduling. And at this point, your book had already been accepted for publication. And she mentioned that when she floated the possibility of a 2024 release, you said you preferred more time to revise it, and that more time that you asked for coincides with your first year of your MFA, which made me curious. Did you find yourself exposing this already accepted manuscript to new eyes at your MFA, that you wanted to invite this new, not entirely known community into that final process with the book, or quite the contrary? You protected this almost ready book from your MFA experience and worked on other things in parallel?
Before I moved to Madison, I had this strong sense that I would protect this manuscript from the institutional experience, and that I was really wanting to honor what it had come out of. And when I came here, I had the intention to be revising, giving myself the time of letting even being back in this region be part of the revision process with me. The life changes I was going through at the time, it felt right to honor that with time as my revision partner, more than thinking about bringing it to anyone here. And I had that more strict idea with myself that I would solely work on new work in this program. And then as it happened, as I was generating new work, I remember in the first semester, it was, Amy Quanberry had us generating like 2 poems a week. I don't write at that pace. We were working with received forms and generating new. And naturally, I was still in the world and questions and obsessions of We Contain Landscapes. Actually, at the time when I entered the program, I was still with the title Anchor Baby that I was doubting at that point was the real title. So I was really in a deep revision space. I was still revising poems from the book. I did start letting myself bring a little bit of that into the workshop. What happened too was that I was surprised by the beautiful cohort of poets I've gotten to study with here. I had really low expectations as someone going later in life to school. I felt, well, fully funded time to get to write and teach and have healthcare. That's about all I'm expecting. If I get any mentorship and connection on top of that, beautiful. And then I was stunned to meet these incredible writers here who also, many of them grew up speaking other languages at home, also share so many wonderings, even as we're all really different poets. So there was this trust that built a lot faster than I expected it to. And then I also just couldn't help but keep writing. I ended up writing poems that made their way into the book, including the very last poem in the book. A number of poems in the book came out of that time. Even into the second semester, just as I had to turn in revisions, there was a prompt that Paula Paltran gave that also allowed a new poem to emerge. And so I couldn't help but let it bleed over in that way, actually. And it's been a beautiful lesson that we can be surprised, even in the ways that institutions do still let us down. It's really a testament to the people I met, that there was this trust that was built. And of course, being back near to here in the region of my childhood, nearer to these bodies of water, a little drive away from Lake Michigan that was formative for me as a child. All of that felt like a necessary partner to revising.
Well, before we hear some poems, since we're talking about the book and how it came to be, let's spend a moment with how you came to be. As you mentioned, the book's title, when it was accepted for publication, was Anchor Baby. And the first poem is titled An Anchor is an Argument, and the penultimate poem is called Bury the Anchor. You yourself are a so-called anchor baby, a term often used pejoratively. So like you did with the book itself, orient us to the circumstances of you, alive but not yet born, or as you say in the book, I was born an ocean away from where I was conceived.
I think that being conceived in one place and born in another necessarily impacted this obsession I have with questions of place and rootedness or lack thereof. And so it's a fascinating term, anchor baby, because I knew that the choices that shaped my arrival here, that this way in which I in part anchored my family legally, this was the manner in which my parents eventually got citizenship. While I knew that was true, at the same time, I've lived so much of my life not feeling grounded at all and feeling this fascinating tension between being a supposed anchor and then having so many different longings for me for other places, both the sort of mythological in my mind motherland of Poland, because I didn't get to go there till I was 19 for my first time. And so it loomed large in my mind and was full of romanticization and all sorts of things before I ever got to go there. In the same way, because of the landscapes I'd heard about, that my mother grew up in a mountainous place. I was so drawn to the West in the US. I went to college in Colorado, not ever having, I saw it when I was really young, and then not ever having seen Boulder, Colorado. I moved there for college and felt something strong in me that wanted to be a part of that place. So all to say, and then I was, flying home very infrequently because of resources and the limitations around how often I could get home. And so that, that old title poem for the book, I was thinking about that sense of knowing that my family was also asking me as I got older to sort of root down in a place, and that was the maybe charge of this phrase of anchor baby, and yet feeling like if one is conceived in one place and born in another, well, there's always going to be a push and pull. And so that sort of awareness as a child, that was pretty hefty, of like, here are the sacrifices that have been made for your life to be better. And the very serious separation of 22 years that my parents were unable to see their families created a pressure that sometimes rooted me and other times just made me want to see all the edges of the earth and to understand that weight. And so that phrase to me is so fascinating too, because of its relationship, of course, to travel to water, to ships, to mooring and unmooring, and this idea that we anchor in order to then set off as well. And so that was some of the origins that led to my being here at all. And then, of course, the particularity of the experience of growing up Polish American to a very Catholic household, and having parents that, despite all of their challenging circumstances, insisted I speak Polish at home and still have a connection to that place through language, and had me in a Saturday Polish school and all those sorts of things. Those are so much a part of my poetry journey, because I was memorizing poems in Polish at a young age, and I was studying Polish literature. And so all of that was also a kind of origin of the book and my own being.
I was hoping we could hear two poems, Vilno and Salt of the Earth.
Sure. Vilno. Of the dream, I remember only a flash. My grandfather playing the violin, chin tucked in music. In life, he never played the instrument. My father tells me his father, born near Vilno, spent a month freezing in the wooden wagon of a freight train, breath forming ice in the hay. He left his birthplace to keep his country. There are stories I long for from their source. I watched YouTube videos of my dziadek's favorite music, Czerwone Gitary, Halina Kunicka. Listen on loop to Filipinki's rendition of Ave Maria. Dziadek is around you then. My father texts me a photo of his father's grave, Babcia's name on the tomb prepared beside. One Saturday, I had to stand in front of the class to recite Mickiewicz's famous lines to Lithuania, Litwo, ojczyzno moja, ty jesteś jak zdrowie. We didn't discuss fathers or the construct of a nation state, how words circulate, thicken the blood over time, summoned like a river by a larger body. I am carried in sleep toward inherited longings. Salt of the earth. In a blurry photo from my first trip to Poland at 19, me and my godmother, one of my mother's 10 siblings, are laughing together 1,000 feet into the earth in a 13th century chapel made entirely of salt. Sculptures carved of rock salt chandeliers, a rock salt Last Supper. In childhood, she was one of many names, a voice on the phone, a formal exchange. Table salt was made there from the upwelling brine, upwelling the closest thing, resembling a wall in water. I feared the door. Someone coming to take my parents away, illegals taking American jobs. In classroom debates about immigration, I kept quiet. Watching my godmother watch her grandchildren running the edges of the creek I wanted to call a river. Slicing bugs from mushrooms picked before dawn, dropping the slivers quick into buckets, asking when will I have children, and haven't I had enough school already, and how is it that we have so much debt in America? Shielded by whiteness, assumed to be documented, threaten the economy, 1 out of every 12 newborns. In another aunt's kitchen, over rosehip tea, she said I wasn't as spoiled as they'd expected for an Americanka. I was proud and devastated to be called American. Providing an advantage to family members seeking to secure citizenship. Silence both protected and betrayed. At 22, running up a blur of pines beyond my uncle's turkeys and geese to where my mama grew up picking blueberries. I planted a little tree where I'm invited to return. The difference between a river and a creek is that from a creek, no new branches are formed. Anchor baby and offensive.
I'm listening to Patrycja Humienik read from her collection, We Contain Landscapes. So the next question from another I'm placing here as a sort of frame for much of the rest of our conversation, because as she admits, she could have asked this question in 10 different ways or asked 10 different questions about the title of the book. And in many ways, I'll be doing just that, taking what she has asked and asking it differently again and again, as I feel there isn't one question or one answer to each question. And in that light, if you don't answer every element of this question, you can be assured that I'm going to be picking up the threads of both the things that you answer to ask again, and also things that you may not answer that we will talk about nonetheless. So this is from the poet Sarah Ghazal Ali, whose debut collection Theophanies was a finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Prize. Kazim Ali says of it, quote, "That God's words would be splintered into many forms and tongues is inevitable and appropriate. This book utilizes many forms, ancient and new, to contend with the long legacy of a multitude of spiritual traditions. The expulsion from the divine, living engendered bodies, the fate of humans to live as mortal. There's music aplenty here to accompany difficult truths, and that is really all one can ask of God or garden or a ghazal." So here's a question from Sarah.
Hi, Patrycja. It's Sarah. Congratulations on this beautiful book. It's a feat, and I'm so excited to ask you a question about it. My question is about the title, We Contain Landscapes. And in all honesty, I could ask you 100 different questions about the 3 words comprising this title, but I'll hold back. So early on in the book, you write, "We contain landscapes, they do not belong to us." And later in the poem Floodplain, you write, "To try to contain anything is to rid it of water. Admit that the water is rising. Admit that you need a flood." And I'm really curious about your relationship as a writer to these 2 ideas, to containment and to the body as a container or a cave of some kind, and to possession and ownership, and perhaps what the difference is between these 2 ideas for you, where they overlap, where they diverge, and also how water comes into play and how landscapes come into play.
Such a pleasure to hear the voices of writers I adore so much. Both Sarah and Gabby's books are works of art. Thank you for this question, which is, I suppose, a question that the whole book asks and wrestles with throughout. I love the astute pairing of those 2 passages, and I think about the Silueta series of Ana Mendietas, where she leaves imprints of a form with flowers and branches and moss and gunpowder and fire. Sometimes she's carving or burning her own form into the earth, which we do daily. We leave a mark in some way. She spoke about her work as sort of carrying out like a dialogue between landscape and the female body, and for her also is particular to being torn from Cuba, from her homeland. And there are often quotations of her, the oft-quoted passage on her overwhelm of having been cast from the womb and from nature, and art as this way, I might be misquoting it, but of returning to like maternal source. And while my questions might slightly, the speaker of this book might conceive of this a little differently, I do feel resonances with her project and with this wondering about our separation or not from the land and the ways we mark it and the ways that we can never own it. And in my longing that I mentioned earlier, that part of me, that restless part of me that felt the pressure of anchoring and yet longed to be everywhere, to know so many different ways of living in the world, is that sort of tension and idea of like the impossibility of like knowing every place, and then knowing that in ourselves there are places uncharted, is an idea I'm really fascinated by. And I didn't encounter this until later. I was at a residency. I was watching more Agnes Varda, and of course, by the time the title of this book came out, so many people sent me the little still shot from one of her films that says, if you carve people open or something like that, you find landscapes. And it wasn't, the title wasn't consciously influenced by Varda, or I hadn't seen that film yet. But I think that idea, a lot of artists wrestle with that question of what is inside and outside of us. And I'm really troubled by ideas of possessing anything at all, and of the impulse, and particularly to own land, is one that has been a really violent project worldwide. And so I think about all of that when I think about this question of containment and what we contain or cannot contain. I think it's endlessly confusing and intriguing for me to think about what we are made up of. And Sarah, of course, brought up water, which, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I grew up near Lake Michigan, and I've been fascinated by lake effect, by the graveyards of the Great Lakes, by the complexity of those ecosystems. There was a weeping willow not too far of a bike ride or long walk from me that in childhood I would go to for comfort. I felt like water was this space for me early on of like reprieve, but not always even comforting so much as just like holding space for grief. And water, bodies of water, are just endlessly fascinating for me as a person and as an artist, as a writer. I think rivers in particular, I think, are just connected to my thinking of the poetic image itself. I think like the poetic image at its best is at once grounding and transporting. It is inextricable from the sensuous material of life, and it's also fantasy, it's imagination, it's myth and irrigation, transportation, border. It's all those things. When you're actually physically near a river, you can feel that, and it's constantly moving. And so the fact that the often quoted, maybe trite fact of our own bodies being made up of so much water, the fact that migration often demands crossing bodies of water, the fact that I haven't heard a more true statement than the Lakota phrase, water is life, heard worldwide in the struggle to protect tribal lands at Standing Rock. Like all of those things are part of my thinking about water and containment, and how water can never be contained. I think too of the inexhaustibility of water as this space of contemplation, and yet fresh water is a finite resource. So that all is on my mind when I think about questions of containment. And then when it comes to another body of water, the sea, I think often of Atul Adnan saying, to look at the sea is to become what one is, which I think I can't say it better than that. And so in the book, there's that wrestling with all the different bodies of water that cannot be contained, and then what exists in the form of our own bodies.
Well, let's spend some time with the word contain, and with containers, and with form. Some lines in the book explicitly engage with it. For instance, the question posed in one line, is a shape always externally imposed? Or, I want form without the rot of control. Or, if belonging is form, its constraints erode the land, recurring floods. And perhaps in that spirit, the line, the desire for excess I inherited. The last third of the book also sort of spills out of any regularity of form two, I think, with a higher amount of formally experimental poems of all different sorts, longer, narrow justified columns, spirals, and short prose blocks. But I also wonder if there's another type of form too, as I think of how you are suggesting we contain landscapes rather than the more familiar notion of landscapes containing us. And you've said in interviews before how you love a world within a line, a poem within a poem, which makes me think of the untranslated epigraph at the beginning of the book by Szymborska, which could be translated, "After all, every beginning is only a continuation." Or if we place it in the full final stanza of the poem it comes from, "Love at First Sight," in the Claire Kavanagh and Stanislaw Baranchuk translation, it would be, "Every beginning is only a sequel, after all, and the book of events is always open halfway through." Where here again, a beginning contains within it its own repetition, which reminds me of the author's note in the advanced reader's copy, where you say you're wearing a ring made of amber from the Baltic Sea from a recent trip to Poland after a decade away, and how this amber ring echoes against the amber ring you lost that your Polish grandmother had given you, and how both amber rings share the memory of a forest that became a sea. That one ring contains the other ring, and both rings contain a forest that is now a sea. So that when you say you wrote this book for your younger selves, wearing this ring that harkens to a younger ring and a younger iteration of the sea as a forest, perhaps is suggestive of a form that does not constrain. I think of a fractal or a hologram or a holographic film. But talk to us about form. Is a shape always externally imposed? Do forms feel controlling? Do constraints need to be eroded and escaped? And when we contain landscapes, which I think of as unbounded spaces, is that a form?
Oh, David, your questions are so generous and rich. I could spend the rest of my life thinking about them. I love that you brought into this question of form, the Bursten, the amber ring, and that memory within that material. I think that is so helpful right now for me in trying to sort my thoughts around this massive question that maybe I'll attempt to think through in a roundabout way of thinking less about the words on the page in the book right now and thinking back to your last question, thinking about the container of the body and thinking about my relationship to dance and how in studying a bit of dance and loving dance so much since childhood, there was this exploration of the limits and possibilities of the body, just as I find so fruitful in language and the line, in writing. The form, the container of the body and its limitations are propulsive for me, and at times they are externally imposed because we receive whatever genetic makeup we receive for the body, just as we inherit certain ideas and shapes for making language, and the language that one even writes in is a form like English. And so, yes, there's a part of me that has always revolted against constraint, against what I sense to be any kind of wall or boundary or border that might contain in a way that is violent. So I can't help but think about, when I think about the question of form, I can't help but sometimes think about walls and borders and violences. And at the same time, then I'm left to think about the body and the shape of the body and what I was just alluding to with dance and the way that being in an embodied form allows for certain kinds of felt experience. And so I think poetry is capacious enough for play with that and for breaking out of ways we've been taught to speak, to use language, to take a very word and examine it in so many ways. That in itself, to even think about etymology, to break it down. And then no form is actually as oppressive as it seems when you can sort of start to take things apart. And so shapes, the question that mysterious, sometimes my own lines are mysterious to me. And that question of shapes being externally imposed. I mean, certainly out in the world, we see and receive shape. But again, I'm obsessed with this idea of the unseen within us. And of course, there's the organs and things we're made up of and the shapes there. And then I wonder about the emotional material, the sort of idea that a lot of brilliant people talk about, like epigenetic memory, other things that form us. And so, God, it's an endless question to me. And in poetry, you get to play with that visual of the shape. I'm not the most, there's so many writers who really take that to such a gorgeous level. I think in this book, I was more interested in, as you astutely noted, the permission giving by the end to take up different kinds of space. And it's not something I assigned myself to do. It's just something that happened once I looked back at the poems and saw them all together. And so I think that answers part of your question.
Yeah. Well, there are lines from Milosz's poem Ars Poetica that make me think of, to borrow your language, the uncontainable excess you've inherited. They go, "The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. But as a way to explore this spirit, I think we need to explore what constraints your work is pushing against or breaking out from. One of the questions you pose in your author's note is, to whom do we belong and at what cost? And one of those belongings is with your family of origin, not only as an immigrant, but in a decidedly gendered way as an immigrant daughter. In one interview, you describe it as a reckoning with imposed and inherited scripts for women, daughters, and sexuality. And you explore this explicitly in your essay, Unlearning My Immigrant Mother's Ideas of Beauty, where you say, I've inherited an idea from both sides of my family about the kind of woman I'm supposed to be. It's an antiquated idea of womanness, but one that persists. It has to do with pleasing others and obedience. Beauty in this view is both regimen and reward. And, like many immigrant daughters, I'm of a lineage of women who didn't put themselves first. I don't have the lived experience of unbridled authenticity and honesty in my personal life, nor do I have many models of it. Writing often feels antithetical to the charge as an immigrant daughter to be a secret keeper, to never bring shame to the family, to obey. On the level of form, inherited forms, and constraint, I thought most of the paragraph in that essay, my mother and I wear the same size. When I fly to my childhood home twice a year, she insists that I don't need to bring much because I can borrow her clothes. I alternate between feeling held and controlled by this. I'm held by her care and by the comfort of the option to arrive with little. I bring my own clothes, but inevitably go to her closet and try on a few of her carefully chosen, hard-earned items. When I wear them, she gives me compliments and an approving look. Sometimes she says, you can keep it. So talk to us more about what you're working through with gender, within the belonging of family and ancestral inheritance through your book, through your writing in this book.
I haven't thought about that essay in some time. And it was a very scary essay for me to write because I think this question of belonging when it comes to family is very delicate, especially for those of us whose families have sacrificed so much for me to even be able to write this book. And so that bit you mentioned that I'm haunted by of the sort of role of the daughter and the way in which to be a writer at all feels at odds with that secret keeping charge, that feels to me particular, to many daughters of immigrants I've talked with about this very thing. To write at all is to threaten all of that, and to threaten then to sever from the bonds that, you know, even brought me here. So in that sense, as I reckon with ideas of gender and sexuality and my own religious and cultural inheritance, it becomes really fraught terrain, has been really fraught terrain for me for some time, because I want to honor all that brought me here. I don't flat out reject. It would be easier if I felt like, oh, I reject everything about, you know, Catholicism or these ideas that, you know, my parents have passed on. And the interesting part as I get older is starting to think about, and it's mentioned in that essay, you know, there's the care element, there's the ways that people attempt to care within the frameworks they have for caring. There's within Catholicism, there are the mystics and the traditions of doubt and questioning and insistence that are the comforts of our lives in America demand of us in some ways, or try to demand of us. Like, I appreciated as a child that my religious background was having me question that there might be something more than the material world, that maybe, you know, at its best, at religions at their best, have some really seed of care, of loving your neighbor. All of that is a part of the question of belonging. These questions of form and containment and bonds to family are the beautiful parts. I can't just completely cut that out either. I'm grateful for some of that inheritance, and I'm also really troubled by the violent legacy of the church that can't be separated from that. And so all of this meandering, it's related to gender, because I mean, the very texts of the hymns of, I remember being at a monastery in New Mexico, that an atheist friend had suggested that me and another friend who were both grappling with our relationship to Catholicism, he said, you've got to go here. It's a great place to like write and be. And you both are, you know, thinking a lot about church and stuff. So you might like it. And we go to this monastery in New Mexico that of course is on like indigenous land. I mean, it's like they've got plaques in there totally revising that violent history. And there's this chapel, and there are these monks who live there and are praying and singing throughout the day. And I was attending some of that and looking at the text itself of the hymns and thinking about the gendered, violent text itself. And then also having like a spiritual experience while I was there, feeling really moved and holding all of that complexity at once. Actually feeling many times like I was going to faint, quite literally having a very strong psychosomatic reaction to that space. I mean, that place along the Chama River, that comes up in the book a bit, in some poems, it surfaces, because I think about that as a place in which I was asking of myself these very questions of feeling the bond back to belonging to this religious tradition to some degree, and being like, can I belong to that? Do I want to belong to that? Don't want to belong to its violent legacies at all. And yet I have to reckon with that. Like I can't pretend that I haven't inherited what I have inherited either. So I think all that is to say, when I think about gender, it is inextricably bound to questions of faith and family for me, and of obedience. And then writing is this way in which I get to question obedience while still through poems uncovering that devotion can still exist. Actually, devotion and obedience are actually different. And then when I was younger, those two ideas were more conflated.
Well, similar to the double feeling you have about being the same body shape as your mother, and then what that means about assuming a form, literally going into the same clothes. In the essay, you also talk about your mother's distress about when you change your Facebook profile to one where you're wearing a secondhand dress and the angle of the photo makes your face look too long, but also where you're caught in motion. You're not composed for the photographer. you're not captured in a specific sort of received form of what you would expect from a photographer taking a photo of someone. And it made me wonder about your relationship with her as you've become a writer, and how much or little of you as writer and her as represented figure in your writing is something shared, or perhaps not shared but acknowledged.
The first thought I had as you read that back, this essay from some years ago, is how petty of me to bring up this moment that does not at all. This is the thing about writing about our families, or writing about anyone, and why I struggle so much with nonfiction sometimes, is that one can take a story like that, and I suppose that's the trouble with language at all, is then diminish the fullness of a person. And sure, there are still these chasms between my mother and I at times grieve them. And on the other hand, I have only grown in my admiration for this person who, at such a young age, got on her first ever plane pregnant with me and gave birth to me without even speaking the language of the staff in the hospital where where I was born. And I have reverence for my mother, and I also have frustrations with her as she has with me. And I hope that I'm bold enough now, by even putting this book in the world, to off the page deepen our relationship in some way. I mean, it's a challenging thing to be as bold off the page as we sometimes are on it, I think, or I'll speak for myself, as I sometimes allow the poems to help me think through things and be more bold. It is something that I want to practice off of it as well. And so when it comes to her and I don't know yet what this book will do for our relationship. I hope that it is only going to deepen it with both of my parents. But I think that that's also the thing that kept me from writing for so very long, was the surveilling eye of the mother of the parents, and not even just them specifically, but even those figures, that idea of the familial gaze and of everything that they've inherited, and the lens with which they look was so prominent and kept me from even writing for myself for so long. It kept me self-censoring. And as a part of, in this book, I'm grappling with ideas of self-deceit and self-betrayal, and the ways that I silenced myself that I can't even blame them for. But I look forward to being more honest if I can. And I think the poems have really written me into a new life. I keep saying that. I really think that the book has pushed me there, and now it's not even mine anymore. And whether I like it or not, I have to maybe engage with some of these questions.
Yeah. One of the ways I think you break out of the vertical lineage-based constraints of inheritance is to reach across horizontally to other immigrant daughters. A series of poems runs throughout the book, the Letter to Another Immigrant Daughter series, that, like the title suggests, are poems addressed, like letters, to a different immigrant daughter, including Sarah, who asked the question earlier. So I was hoping, as a preface to reading one of them, I was hoping you'd read the one to Itiola. If you could speak about this series, what it means to you, how you chose the people you wanted to address, why you wanted to address them, and in this way, and then perhaps we can hear that example of one.
That series was born out of an epistolary exchange with Sarah, who asked the question earlier. We met in a online workshop with Leila Shati, and were drawn to each other's work and questions quickly. And I had the luck of starting this exchange with her in poems, where we were writing these sort of letters addressed to the other. And a fragment of that makes its way into the book in the poem for her. And at the same time, I was thinking about the constellation of immigrant daughter poets in my life and artists in my life who'd also been born to people from elsewhere all over, and thinking about, as different as all of our stories are, all of these shared obsessions and threads. And so through that exchange with Sarah, I was also thinking about various conversations I had or was currently having with these other beautiful people. And I feel like I could have just gone on and on, but I think what happened was that I really went with the conversations, exchanges that were lingering in my mind, and in moments where I was wanting so badly to write, but it made the most sense to address someone who I'd just been in conversation with. And that's how a lot of those poems emerged, or in some cases, even there were poems that were sort of failed poems, I could say, fragments of poems that I couldn't figure out. And then I would think about a conversation I had with one of the writers that I write a letter for in the book. This happened in multiple occasions, where then I was like, oh, that and that, this fragment and this fragment, it all actually makes so much more sense when I'm addressing it to this person. I can make sense of it. It's that intergenerational reaching and making sense of long held questions that in the book, when I tried to maybe, as you mentioned, go vertically and think intergenerationally, there was no response, maybe because of me trying to speak to the dead, or because of the questions unanswered by my parents working really hard and questions I didn't even feel like I could formulate to them. So the intergenerational reaching became the place, also because in poetry, I'm not necessarily reaching for a single answer. In fact, I'm suspicious of a single answer and constantly arguing with myself about different ideas. And so that was a place for those, a better word than argument. That was just the place for that, like making and unmaking together, for the rethinking it and reshaping it. And it just was happening already in my life relationally, in conversations we were having, in voice memos and texts and in real life, and walking near a waterfall, or a call after much time not seeing one another. And so it is through the brilliant, I mean, this book is indebted to like the brilliant questioning conversations with other people. I really don't see it as a solitary act to write at all. And I'm lucky to get, it's never a solitary act for anyone because of the long conversation happening with the dead. And I'm lucky to get to speak with both the living and the dead in this book. Letter to another immigrant daughter, for Tiola. Like my father, I love trains and beautiful women. When have you let yourself go off the rails? I first wrote off kilter, but kilter sounds like a word that would position me at an edge. I'd look out and call the view stunning, slip a hand in my pocket to touch other borders, feeling for the place in the linen worn thin from repeated touch, that cliff of too much, trench of a thought ached over, aching still. There are train rides I wish I'd taken. Clamor on all sides en route to the dining car, watching rivers and the trees at their banks hinged in splintered urge. They clench their roots and each other close so as not to fall in. Let landscapes skip rocks across our faces, pressed up against the glass. Tell me a story. Tell me everything. Your laugh widens the gaze. If the trees watch us, in one flicker they see where breath is held. I'm not sure a daughter can ever be grateful enough. Some days I am thankless, fogging up the window, drying hearts.
Been listening to Patrycja Humienik read from We Contain Landscapes. So in your essay about your mother, there is a counterbalance to fitting into your mother's clothes or into the matrilineal form, which is the photography of Francesca Woodman, the avant-garde and now iconic photographer from Boulder, my hometown and where you went to university. Photography where she is often the subject, not uncommonly unclothed. Often there's a sense of motion, of shadow, of blur, something uncanny and dreamlike, as if the camera both can't capture something and maybe in not capturing it is capturing something very real, but usually unseen, a psychic landscape perhaps. You say in that essay, performance and the page are where I practice enacting the autonomy I aspire towards. And in that spirit, we have a question for you. It's not about performance per se, but about the body in relation to your poetry. And especially when I think about your somatic work off the page too, I'm curious about your answer. This question is from the poet Joanna Klink, author of 5 books, most recently The Nightfields. She's the winner of many accolades, including a Guggenheim and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, where Nobel laureate Louise Glick said in her citation, "In a culture inclined to mistake opacity for depth and stridency for passionate feeling, Joanna Klink has made a body of work at once utterly lucid and breathtakingly urgent. She navigates between those most suspicious extremes, despair and ecstasy, without ever seeming to be a poet dependent on extremes. The extraordinary beauty of her poems, from the beginning, has resulted from a constantly refined attention to the ordinary and the daily. Taken together, her books are an amazing experience, harrowing, ravishing, essential, unstoppable." Here's the question from Joanna.
Patrycja, I admire your work so much, and this book is especially important to me because the poems are so deeply physical and visceral. You use your whole body as an instrument, attentive to extreme pleasure and pain, always leaning on your senses, and the struggles in the book seem to stream through your body. Many of your poems express a kind of extravagant longing to belong, to connect, and not just with lovers and friends, but with countries, with a God, with forces far beyond yourself. And this desire to belong requires that you leave your body behind. There are so many poems where I feel this in the book, but I'm thinking in particular of archival and recurring, where you're physically disembodied or almost engulfed in a wall of water. So there's a threat of obliteration in the desire. It reminds me of that late poem by Paul Celan, translated as "Discus starred with premonitions." And the whole poem is, "Discus starred with premonitions. Throw yourself out of yourself." It's an impossible instruction. And I wonder if this tension I'm trying to describe between being acutely physically present to what's happening to you, grounded in your body, and the need to wrench yourself out of that body in order to connect. I wonder if this resonates at all with your experience of writing these poems. And I wonder how this tension might be tied to your sense of yourself as a daughter of immigrants, someone like Celan himself, who lived painfully between countries and languages, displaced from his Romanian homeland.
Wow. Should we just play that again so we can hear that articulation again? Because you said so much.
Pretty great.
That sums it up. I'm so grateful for that and for Joanna's attentive read to this book and the generous blurb. I love that question. And I think of so many things. I mean, it's astounding to me because there's actually a poem of Joanna's on kingdoms that I at one point had memorized that I think feels like one of those poems of many that felt instructive for this book. And thinking about the questions in that poem that also feel like they reach toward different longings and possible separations. I think also with this question about another phrase that often pops to mind, and the work of Etel Adnan is often on my heart. And she has that amazing "I go always faster than I go" line, and it's from a passage that earlier in it she talks about each year I might be misquoting it, but each year I get younger. I'm a year younger, and I love the articulation in some of Etel Adnan's work of this tension and possibility. I see it too in this impossibility and possibility that I see too in June Jordan's Bell's Theorem. I don't remember the whole title of that poem, but that's another one that I think of those lines so much. They're also always in the back of my mind of on the theorem on long distance love. And
I love that poem.
Oh, it's so good. There is no chance that we will fall apart. There is no chance. There are no parts. And I think that's some of the unbelievable mystical question that we have of the body. Well, on one hand, of course, there are parts of the body. And on the other hand, yeah, this potential for wholeness and our non-separation. I think it is all of those things definitely are a driving engine. Those tensions, those supposed paradoxes are definitely part of what helped me write this book and made it so that the questions of this book are questions I'll keep wrestling with. And I think too about, I mean, gosh, I think about even, you know, in your work, David, I felt so lucky that in that On Rivers issue that I got to curate, and I published that piece of yours. And I think also of like, the time of the soul is not the time of the calendar. And so like all of these questions of the time that is ticking and that is measurable and the time that feels immeasurable. And again, going back to spirals and Gabby's question at the very beginning, the fact that at any moment there is past, present, future. I mean, all of that is like a driving force of poetry to me. I think I've just inherited that material as a poet at all. Like, I think it's ages old to question like separation and wholeness and time and the body and all of those things. And so the embodiment piece for me is that I have to actually use my hands to write something, and I have to remember that. I have to remember that it doesn't just happen in the mind. And dance is such a gift for me in that way because it's gifted me different practices, even something as deceivingly simple as feeling my feet when I'm writing and thinking, well, what's the temperature? Where are they touching or not touching the floor beneath me? Where is that floor connected to the earth? It's actually a vital exercise for me to sometimes when I write attempt to think of a body part and put my attention there. I don't always do it, but sometimes when I'm writing, I play with that and remind myself that this work doesn't just happen in the head, actually, or in the brain. And the brain itself is part of the body. And so it's all, I mean, all of that sounds so basic, and yet I think it is being like snatched up from us at all times because of the pace of our living and the insistence on a pace that denies the body. I think we're in a time of such like a demand for instant gratification and speed. And so when I write, I have to really slow down in order to go to another place that is not just the conditioned place from which to compose something. And I think the body is one passageway there. And in the question, Jonah mentioned archival, and that poem came out of a very embodied experience of being invited to teach a workshop in the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, where they had this exhibit called Archive of Longings by Diana Al-Hadid, an incredible Syrian-American sculptor, visual artist. And I invited people to both write and be in that space and move in that space. And she had all these disembodied sculptures. She had like headless sculptures and feet and legs separated from the body and made of all these both earthly and man-made materials, copper and steel, and just exquisite, some really huge pieces in there, and questions she had, like in those, with those headless sculptures. I believe that there was a question in there in the artist's plaque about something about how much I wondered how much of me could be lost and I'd still be there, or something like that. Like she is wrestling with so many shared questions and what Joanna just articulated. And so being in the space of her art, like archival, came out of that. And from also seeing other people in that space near the sculptures and thinking about feet, which there's an obsession with that idea of that which takes us elsewhere and allows us to walk, and these questions of migration, and then to see them in the physical form that Diana Al-Hadid had rendered it as sculpture was so moving for my work. And so for me, it's like impossible to write without also being in my own body, acknowledging other bodies, like looking at how bodies are fragmented or not, in art and in life. And so it's such an endless question, but that's some of what I would say.
Could we hear the poem Archival?
Yeah. Archival. I descend the gallery stairs to the history of women, where my legs are cut off at the knee, carved with the knife of ecstasy. I lie down halved, next to the instrument of my thinking, not the bodiless head, but feet, their subduction in bronze, polymer, gypsum. Migration is the story of longing, is the story to risk, rupture for rapture. Footprints on the ceiling, a ladder I tug down from its primeval coil. Steel, fiberglass, and copper, where finish splits from color, longing is ribless as a scorpion. Do not fix me to the vanishing point. I cannot afford to lose what I cannot possess.
So to return to Sarah's question about water and to link it to Joanna's describing being engulfed in a wall of water, let's talk again about water. I know you already have, but it is, I think, one of the two most prominent themes, perhaps the most prominent theme. Here are some lines from the book. A book that is full of and overfull of rivers and seas and floodplains. I'm watching my favorite dancer, feeling the ghost of my teenage body, a river rushing superimposed boundaries. Do to me what sunlight does to a river. The difference between a river and a creek is that from a creek, no new branches are formed. To try to contain anything is to rid it of water, admit that you need a flood. Summoned like a river by a larger body. I'm watching two bodies of water converge. I want to know the details that crossed seas. The water I am made of asks me to be quiet in it. I was born an ocean away from where I was conceived. Life is precious, monstrous, marked by tides. River speaks in reverse elegy. I will seek the freshwater lake at the bottom of the sea. Reading these, I notice also the word body shows up a lot in relationship. The bodies of water show up very much in the description of water. Also outside the book, as we've both alluded to, you curated a community anthology at Seventh Wave, the one that you invited me to be a part of, with the theme On Rivers. And in your intro to the On Rivers anthology, you say, "A river is a contested site. I return again and again to rivers, real and imagined. In Natalie Diaz's poem, The First Water is the Body," she writes, "Do you think the water will forget what we have done, what we continue to do?" So water is on my mind too, as this is going to be the first of 3 extremely water-centric conversations this spring. And like the others, it doesn't feel just like metaphor, but something you're exploring in its own right for meaning. Perhaps something you're connecting to as a different form of lineage. To me, it's suggestive of another form that isn't a form, like the Milosh line I read earlier about how it's difficult to remain one person, a form that is a river, a glacier, a mist, a lake, rain, sweat. But I want to say, what's the deal, Patrycja? But you've already spoken to it, as I knew this would happen with Sarah's question, which itself contains landscapes. But let's return to the question, why water? What is your relationship to water? As teacher, mentor, lovers, strangers? Is water a form? What's the relationship to containment? Or how is a river a reverse elegy? Anything that comes to mind from me reading your lines back to you.
I think water is at once a vehicle for dreaming and for being present with. So what I mean is that dreaming not as escape. I think water reminds me that all of that is happening at the same time, that it can be a kind of portal, that because it is moving and arguably really difficult to contain, it can carry us to unimagined places. And at the same time, when we feel it, when we step into a river or a lake or the sea, at least for me, when I do, I can't help but feel its temperature or its pull of the current or a tide. I am immediately forced to be with my body, whether I like it or not, even just to, in the case of the dangers maybe of like the sea or a quick current, I have to be to protect myself. In that way, like thinking and being in the body, it's easy to romanticize these things. It's also like dangerous, like thinking, being really in our bodies, like these are things that can hurt us. And water can hurt us. Water can ravage a place. We're seeing with climate catastrophe this reality. So my obsession with water, like, of course, there's the danger that I will romanticize it to a degree that negates like the harm of very real things right now, like floods, for example. I think one can't contemplate water without thinking about each other and ecosystems and nourishment and danger and rupture and all of that, and the precarity of all of this, and the both endlessness and preciousness of all this. I'm thinking about Ruthie Gilmore, the prison abolitionist and scholar, saying where life is precious, life is precious. Water is just like reminding me of that. Like it's so precious. Like having clean water is unfortunately really a privilege, actually. And so I think it's like inexhaustible for me to contemplate water with all the other questions that I set forth to attempt to start to unpack in this book, whether it's the ideas we've been talking about belonging and questions of place and home or desire, all of these things. I think it's like, what better vehicle to think through it than a river, which connects to the veins of the earth? What better way to contemplate like love, which can be so nourishing and so terrifying and can utterly reshape our lives. And so that's the endlessness of water for me. And of course, it doesn't surprise me at all that you have other people you'll be talking to about water that'll eagerly be tuning in to hear that from, because I think sometimes writers get anxious. Sometimes I talk with writers when I teach or edit, and I think there's an anxiety around like some kind of newness or invention that needs to happen. And I just wonder about that. And I think these deceivingly basic things like water are worthy of our deeper attention and questioning.
Well, if water is everywhere in your work, the one thing that's as ubiquitous is your engagement with devotion, which you've alluded to earlier. In the poem On Devotion, there are the lines, "Winters ago, on the phone, a friend saying, 'Jealousy is good because it is a form of protection.' Then you saying, 'But what if protection is a form of harm?'" And later in that poem, easy to confuse habit with ritual, ritual with devotion, devotion with desire. And then you have an essay that you wrote about the poem of Joanna Klink's that you've memorized called On Kingdoms. And you say that what draws you most to that poem is one particular sentence, which you feel like is the poem's pulse. And that line is, devotion is full of arrows. You've also taught a writing and movement workshop called Devotion and Play. You've offered one-on-one workshops called Devotion and Creative Practice. And yet, despite all of this, you say you aren't sure what devotion is. In your Substack newsletter, which is called, wait for it, On Devotion, you say, there is something I am learning about devotion from rivers, how they move toward a larger body, their pursuit of sea. And you take this notion of pursuing a larger body to suggest devotion has to do with something bigger than us. But you also say, as obsessed as I am with the idea of devotion, I have no definitions or answers for you, only questions and ongoing arguments with myself. So I was hoping you'd argue for us and with us about devotion. You've alluded earlier that devotion is different than obedience. Is devotion something uncontainable? Why this continual return to devotion? And this framing of so many things as a pursuit of or interrogation of devotion?
I find it really interesting to try to sort through differences between, as I do in the poem that you mentioned on devotion, devotion and desire. What's the difference between that, devotion and obedience? I think that anytime I've brought that word to a room full of people, like in a teaching context or a conversation, it right away, always there's such a range of response because it connects to these major questions of faith. It has often religious associations, questions of romance and love and partnership and making a family, questions of our passion in life, maybe devotion to a cause, to an art form. It is that the word touches on so many essences of being human and so many of the ways we've maybe been disciplined into being a way that some of us might be riding against. I would venture to say that asking anyone about their relationship to the question of devotion would be very interesting because of those different elements that and knowing what comes up for someone. So for me, at different times in my life, I'm thinking about it through different lenses, whether it's in thinking about romantic relationships, thinking about my relationship to poetry itself, that has brought me back to the Midwest, as perhaps one could say a devotion to this art form. And in that has been a risk, a leap, some kind of act of trust. And I do think it's distinct from obedience. I think it's something else. And yet I inherited ideas about like religious devotion that were filtered through the lens of obedience, of not questioning. And so as I have been thinking about devotion as very connected to questioning, that's really opened up a lot for me. You mentioned like the devotion and play workshop. I love putting in conversation those two words that sometimes people see as very binary, and thinking, wait, are they actually? Is there something playful in devotion? Is there devotion in the idea of play? It just is endlessly generative, both for things we can try out and literally play with in like embodied exercises and being playful. But just that lens of devotion on anything is really interesting to me. That in that poem, there's the question of like, is bringing a lover a glass of water an act of devotion? If we keep repeating something, if we do that every night, night after night, how are ritual and devotion different, if at all? And I don't have answers as predictably as I said, but I think that it is a way to make new choices, as an invitation. You asked earlier about gendered ideas and inherited scripts. And I think that for me, to keep rethinking my relationship to devotion, whether to other people, to an inherited faith tradition, to poetry, to the things I love in this life, to the ways I want to love better, then I have to keep making a choice to do that. And maybe in that too, I've been thinking a lot about refusal and refusing ideas in this moment that we have, that is particularly, I think when I say we, I think about those of us in the States. I think about the pressure on many people around the globe to not actually be in touch at all with any of our desires and needs for the sake of a pace dictated elsewhere. And so devotion is a kind of antidote for me, even as I'm learning what that even means. But that room in it for people to decide, what am I devoted to? What does that mean to me? What have I been told I should be devoted to? What can I refuse within that? It feels both fruitful for working on the page and then also toward aspiring toward any kind of collectivity, if that is even at all possible, which this book dreams toward by using the failure of the we, the pronoun we. Like there is that maybe that devotion is that pathway toward that impossible dream of some kind of collectivity.
Well, one of the ways I connect water and devotion in this book is the eros and sexuality within the collection, which feels like it's grappling with the ways desire doesn't fit within containers. I'm not sure for sure what those containers are for you, whether they are monogamy, heteronormativity, or really any relationship that involves a certain baked in expectation or promise. But I think of the lines I already read: easy to confuse habit with ritual, ritual with devotion, devotion with desire. But even more so, I think of the line, to risk rupture for rapture. And to try to contain anything is to rid it of water, admit that you need a flood, and avoiding great pleasure to avoid great pain is a kind of obedience antithetical to music. So talk to us about risking rupture for rapture.
I'm so glad you articulated this, because in your last question, you mentioned that amazing line that I didn't talk about: devotion is full of eros. And of course, the word eros sounds like eros. And I love that line from Joanna Klink. And I think that it does so much in that one line that in different parts of my book I might be trying to do, which you so astutely note is part of this very thing, that the erotic, that thinking about pleasure, that thinking about owning that, not owning, that's not the word I want to use at all, of facing that pleasure maybe and not being afraid of it, is actually really linked to devotion for me, and these questions, as you note, of containment and moving beyond what has been prescribed to us. And certainly it is a time still, even in the year 2025, when these are taboo wonderings still. It just seems shocking. And so to wonder about sex and pleasure, which also can feel very indulgent amidst the many struggles we have right now. I think I've been really thinking about, like, is it indulgent though? And I mean, so many people have written about like pleasure activism. Of course, we have Audre Lorde way back talking about the transformative power of the erotic. These are not new ideas, and yet they are still newly contested in very unimaginative and mundane and heteronormative, boring ways that really like restrict the imagination of what's possible in relating to another person and the care that's possible between us all. I think that I'm speaking vaguely because it is still scary for me to talk about this. It's still, especially with the ideas I grew up with, and that secret keeping part that I mentioned of immigrant daughterhood and respect in the family and the privacy that was sort of instilled in me as a value. And yet what happens in our bedrooms is so connected to what's happening out in the world and the dreams we can make together in romance. I am, whether I like it or not, of romantic. And I think that that is a space for like refueling and for thinking about like what can we imagine and make together. I mean, it's no wonder that poets across centuries are obsessed with questions of love and desire, because it is a life force. It is a life force. And so I think that it's a question that troubles and excites me, because it is still very much, there are so many powers that be that want to infringe upon what's possible in our own relationship to one another, to pleasure. And yet it is also, for decades, there are so many queer people who have found spaces and ways to love one another, even when that legislatively wasn't possible. There's all these examples of rupture, of finding a way out of containment in some way for rapture, and for this idea that actually that is even part of my parents' story in coming here at all, even as very religious people, even where there's might be chasms between our worldview. The dream in migration itself, the love that they had for each other, them giving birth to me, has its own like erotic and dreaming component. And so I have inherited that question too. And I think it is also hard to talk about sometimes when there's so much senseless violence and harm, that I do also want to be careful about the kind of advocacy I do for pleasure as a white American. But I do believe that within that, in a profound way, there is something there for each of us that will replenish us for the struggles ahead.
Well, could we hear Eros and Sorrow and I Found a Lover and We Left the City?
Eros and sorrow, lance every boat anchored in memory's harbor. Offshore, someone is moaning in swells that unswell, cacophony of bells, bowl of honey pelvis rocked to pleasure, rocked to tears. I'm crying after sex. Kettles going off and off, the arrows in that sound could puncture even steel. I pour slowly, opening a curtain in the back of mind. Out the window, the diving swallows thieve my periphery with ceaseless flight. I came from this theft of what cannot be mine, not time or rivers. Even my devotions refuse possession. Tiny, entangled butterflies chart a constellation around my head, circumventing the lens. The oak on the bluff has a hole in it. Like an exposed heart, I want to make myself small enough to climb into, but trees don't need hearts. I'm carving a face into the stump and my sternum before it splinters to kindling. I'm harvesting nettles from forests half sunk in my ribs. Marsh in mouth, a hurricane wept into 29 tabs open. I'd draw you a map if it would not divide. We contain landscapes. They do not belong to us. I found a lover and we left the city, temporarily. Crackle of the fire said as much, temple into the sprawl of limbs which came later. First, the alchemists. Oysters we ate quietly as we could, laughing, not saying a word, eyes full of language. And it wasn't that no one had ever touched me before, but it had never been like this, tunnel-less, not a search for a prize, zippered pearl to coax out of grieving, not the scarcity of hardship or the dismissal of it, but we did look up, air glow, sky a cicatrix, purpling, paler, damage and the need to undo it, not to fix, but to unribbon the past. My mama grew up in a rural place, rolling hills of jade. My name betrayed her wish to leave that lack. Szlachetnie urodzona, desire for wealth and its associated ease. I don't blame her for using a name like a tool for weeding. I too prune and tug at my story, but she wanted me to live up to my name, and for that I might blame her. I learn other names, plants that please me, forsythia, hyacinth, pyracantha. My lover gives me a dried bouquet. I prefer weeping, willow, even seaweed, something of water. I want not to say this, but to be understood with my eyes the way I was for a moment by the fire. But some lovers are not for lasting, though that part comes later. If I, must I tell the truth?
Been listening to Patrycja Humienik read from We Contain Landscapes. So one other major character in the book is Poland, the country. In the author's note, you say, I am a daughter of formerly undocumented Polish immigrants from a country that's been taken off the map, whose borders have been drawn and redrawn over centuries. In the book itself, you speak of, quote, great Polish poets born in cities that no longer belong to Poland. And Poland is portrayed as a vexed relationship of love, distance, absence, rupture, return, and departure, where you say, if I make of myself the mythical protagonist, she must journey against fixed belonging. But talk to us about Poland, the country with borders on a map, and how the story of it getting smaller, perhaps hearkening back to the line, if belonging is form, its constraints erode the land. How does this story, the way you tell it, fit into what you're exploring in We Contain Landscapes?
Yeah, in the poem that you mentioned, Border Wound, I mention that the birthplaces of so many greats like Czesław Miłosz, Adam Mickiewicz, Adam Zagajewski are all now different countries. And the very place near where my grandfather was born, the poem I read earlier, Vilno, is also now Lithuania. And my grandparents had a choice. My grandfather had a choice at that point to stay or to go and still retain, to still be Polish. And that question for me early on in Polish school, I mentioned in that same poem in Vilno, standing up in front of the class, Mickiewicz has this famous Polish poem, and it's an ode. It's an ode to Lithuania. It starts Litwo, ojczyzno moja. And so that for me, from an early age, made me question nation and borders and what Polishness meant at all, while also feeling very grateful and proud to be speaking Polish at home, to have this connection to the culture through language. And so language has actually been my tether, even as the borders change, the political realities change, that I wasn't there, didn't even get to go there for my first time, as I mentioned, till I was 19. It was speaking the language, reading the work of writers past that connected me to the place and helped me sort of build up this mythology of it. And so that then in the few trips I've had there, I've had to reckon with the places where there are gaps, where the language itself has evolved as languages do, where there are things I don't understand. And on my most recent visit, which Gabby mentioned, that I was finishing up production for this book, it's true, I was looking over, making copy edits while I was on a train with landscapes flickering past, headed up north to the Baltic Sea in Poland. And I was there for my first time in 10 years. And I got this glimpse of also the very alive literary scene in Poland, and meeting some writers there and bewilderingly encountering a small press, becoming friends with someone who runs a press where they translated the work of writers like Natalie Diaz, her post-colonial love poem, into Polish, a book that means so much to me. The Alexis Pauline Gumbs, it's Wydawnictwo Współbycie is the press in Poland, that I was so stunned to find all of this kinship in and be able to speak in Polish with another writer and thinker about these major questions, like many of the ones we've been orbiting in this conversation, in the language that I had used in a much more constricted manner when I was younger, in church on Sundays, in Polish school on Saturdays, maybe memorizing something, in the narrow confines of the conversations my parents and I would have. That understanding of the Polish language mirrored my understanding of Poland. And then when I went to Poland and I suddenly stretched my use of the language and got to talk about literature and queerness and desire and nation states and all of this. Suddenly I was like, oh, wow, I don't know Poland at all. I'm like reconnecting with this whole other Polishness in meeting particularly other like queer Polish writers was a huge transformative thing for me in the understanding of Poland as a place, which even with the spaciousness of the trip that I had there this summer was not nearly enough time to make any kind of sense of that nation amidst rising fascism across the globe and really trying to understand the political reality there. It's not something I've wrapped my head around at all, and in fact feel like there's so much learning of history, that so many gaps I have in my understanding of Polish history. And so in the book there's just like a grappling with that very thing. I mean, I wrote the book before I went back, after I hadn't been back in 10 years. So it would have probably been a very different book in the aftermath of that trip, but I'm glad that I could put down what I did, including some of that romanticization and those gaps. I mean, there's quite literally a big gap in the page on that border wound page, a place for the different outlines of the map of Poland and its shifting shape, a place for the gaps that I don't have an answer to. And so it's something that I dream of, to spend more time there. And it's been really beautiful to meet Polish people with shared questions, or Polish diaspora people with shared questions, because the country's national identity is as it's changing, but has been so conservative. And so it's a troubling and exciting time to be reckoning with Polish identity. And I feel lucky to be asking those very questions with other Polish diaspora thinkers.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question that you pose about Poland and Polish identity in relationship to the map and borders and its past history. At one point, quite a large empire in Europe with the Lithuanian Commonwealth, and then, as you refer to in the author's note, for a period of time not even on the map, and then shrinking in a variety of other ways. But you say in the book, did I inherit a colonial mentality from a people whose country was partitioned, disappeared from the map? I come from a people who weren't colonizers, but did they want to be? I would love to hear the subtext of the question for you, because I wasn't sure. I don't think you meant to say, but perhaps you did, that to be a settler here in the U.S., you would have had to have come from a colonizing country or a country that dreamed to colonize. But I guess really what I want to know is what is behind that question, and what that question means in relationship to the work and in relationship to Poland's notion of itself.
Yeah, it's a hefty question, and no, you're right to say that's not what I meant by that question. It's more specifically directed at thinking through Polishness and Polish national identity, and particularly right now, you have a lot of intense xenophobia and a lot of rhetoric that I find really troubling. How often nation states will rely on that kind of rhetoric and weaponize ideas of safety in order to assert an idea of national identity that I have a lot of questions about and take issue with. And so I do wonder about this desire by the powers that be to have power. I mean, Poland and US relations are such that for so long it was so hard. It still can be challenging to get a visa here as a just to visit. I mean, I had cousins who were trying, even once the case of a cousin trying to come on a trip with an orchestra and their visa was denied, and you have this country that keeps allying with the United States and keeps also being and has this history of allyship with the United States and has also been constantly being promised things that weren't delivered and looks to the West, I think, and I'm wary to talk about these things because again, I think there's so much I have to learn, but I think like has been westernized in all these ways and yet continues to be failed by the forces of the West, the so-called West. And so there's this entrenchment with national identity, the xenophobia, this intensity, the alignment with like the rising powers of fascism, that is a complex aspect of Polish national identity and its connection to whiteness that I really want to think through as a white Polish American risking romanticizing my homeland and want to keep thinking about the ways in which even its intense connection to Catholicism, which has, of course, been also a force, a partner in colonization across the globe, is like something to unpack and to not flatten in my own desire to connect to that place. And so those lines in that messy, longer poem on chronic conditions are really thinking through inherited relationship to and fantasies about power. And when a people have been so disempowered, like there's a lot of Polish history and a lot of like anger about violences that have happened, about struggles that even within my family, there's just a lot of hurt over history. And so within that, I'm thinking about the lie that then the state provides of how to deal with that hurt, which is actually something that I think we must refuse. And so any kind of national project then is entangled with that. And so then when I think about Poland and Polishness and my own longing to honor that side of myself, that language, I have to also be careful to refuse that type of thinking.
Well, as you've mentioned, you grew up speaking Polish at home. And of your two epigraphs, one is a translated one, a quote by Julio Cortázar. The other is the untranslated epigraph by Szymborska. And occasionally, as I think people have already discovered, we get untranslated Polish in the poetry itself. And you did this recent interview with Miriam Malena for the Bellingham Review, a writer who's also of Polish heritage. She talks about how your book feels haunted by so many people and so many bodies all the time, that if she closes her eyes, she sees ghosts, ancestors, and family members and more. She brings up your ghost MFA committee of 12 poets that you posted on Instagram. This dream committee of poets most important for you are of all nationalities, from Palestinian to Japanese to Spanish to Polish. I'd love to hear more about the poets that make up this committee, a committee that is perhaps another landscape that you contain. But I was also hoping you could speak to your Anglophone lineage in poetry versus your Polish lineage in poetry, particularly, given how storied a tradition of poetry Poland has. How and where do you situate your sensibility between these two worlds, if you think about it at all? And how do they blend and spill into each other? Or how do they refuse to mix, like the freshwater lake at the bottom of the sea, perhaps? Are there idiosyncrasies taken from the Polish tradition that you're using in English language poetry that maybe we wouldn't catch, that are less obvious choices that an American poet wouldn't make or are not in vogue in the contemporary American scene? But anything you want to say about these parallel lineages, if they are parallel lineages?
I'd love to be more conscious of those patterns of language and how they've imprinted upon me. But some of that is just so intuitive in how I write, where I can't help but believe that definitely the Polish language has impacted how I write in English. I just don't always know how. And I think I'm reconnecting with and trying to investigate that. Your question is well timed because I've been reflecting on that trip in Poland and wanting to return to reading more in Polish, which is something that forever, like every writer, there are the stacks of books that I have to read in English alone. And then I dream of reading in Polish and Spanish more too. And I think it's the reading, when I return to reading in Polish at times, that I can sense something different in the music, in that music. And I know that that music has mapped its way onto me, and not always in ways I can explain. But I think I reach also toward poets of all nations because of that rich cacophony, those different musics possible. I love the feat, the impossible feat that translation is. I find it fascinating. But the truth is, I read the most in English, although a fair amount of the writers on that 12, those 12 of the Ghost Committee, there are some that I read through translation, like Alejandra Pizarnik. I read her both in Spanish and English, but more often in English. And I get so much out of those incredible translations and extracting the Stone of Madness. And Darwish, obviously, I read in translation, and among other like Palestinian poets that are translated that I read. And I still, my main engagement with poetry has been in English in recent years. When I was really young, as I mentioned, I had the luck of studying poems in Polish, but at that point, it wasn't a deep study and it was somewhat forced upon me. And I even was not feeling super connected to the work of Polish poets at that time that I now feel so much more connected to, like Szymborska, who there's a poem in the book on reading Szymborska at Friday Harbor where I talk about this very thing, about how my relationship to her work changed over time. I allude to that. And so that sort of Ghost Committee for me too is about writers that gift me different kinds of music and engagement with image and the line, and even as different and varied as they all are, like Bridget Pegeen Kelly's poetry being so very different from June Jordan or from Lucy Brock Broido or from Pizarnik or Zagajewski. I do feel like there's a shared, well, I'm still learning what the threads are, but like a shared boldness, a voracious approach to language that I get that strong felt feeling when I'm reading any of their work and I'm thinking about what that is, like the hard to articulate threads between any work that moves me is instructive for me as a writer. And the same goes for how it can be that mysterious question of how the work still strikes me in translation into English, for example. And so that's all part of the constellation for me. Like deep reading is always gonna gift me new music that I can't even always fully trace how it shows up in my work, but I know it does. I know that the work is indebted to so many writers that have come before.
Well, let's hear reading Szymborska at Friday Harbor.
Yes, this is a poem in a lineage of poems of reading so-and-so at this place. But this poem does engage overtly with Arya Aber's reading Rilke at Lake Mendota, which here in Wisconsin, where I now live, in more than just the sense of reading a poet in a place lineage, but also some of the shared questions I feel kindred to in Arya's poem. So this is reading Szymborska at Friday Harbor after Arya Aber. Do I want more music from language? Curled into myself against a floor-to-ceiling window, I laugh about the Yeti poem, cry over her 1996 speech, whatever inspiration is. It's born from a continuous I don't know. I read it in English. In Polish school, I did not like her work. I did not want to admit how much I don't know, how many fields of oil burning, the everlasting snow melting. I'm watching an eagle perched for the hunt, white-headed metronome, wrapped. Still I ask for song, unspooling in sound. How can I trust myself when I am so seduced by beauty? Scenic lookout, hot women on Instagram, denim sky, muscle of petals. I am not singing, says the eagle. A tired roar crowds my mouth. When we drive down Sweet Pea Lane, Gabby says, so sweet, it makes my teeth hurt. I write it down.
I love that poem. Well, I was going to ask you questions about form and home in relation to real land versus imagined. I feel like you've answered this in a deep way, but nevertheless, I'm going to just read a couple of things that you write about it in the work. In Anchor Baby, you say, if I could bind myself to a place, put cut flowers in a vase, I would thank my mother that way. Instead, I pour the petals out. And in other places, you say things like, let landscapes skip rocks across our faces. And he left his birthplace to keep his country. And I'm looking for the place where the trees unmake our image. Also, no such thing as the world, I touch fragments. And yes, there are songs without flags. Thinking about the notion of an anchor as an argument and about home and belonging and the dual way you looked at anchors, I can't quite tell if your longing is for belonging as Joanna suggests, or the opposite of being summoned like a river to a larger body that isn't you, a larger body that perhaps is unknown, but maybe, as you suggested around Etel Adnan, also is somehow you, looking at the sea. But I just wanted to read the line by Bjork that inspired one of your poems, because I feel like this captures an element of your book at large too, which is, you have to imagine something that doesn't exist and dig a cave into the future and demand space, which feels like this great intersection of imagination and actual physical land or physical space. But as we come to an end, what I'm going to do for the next question, I want to return to the notion of beginnings as we come to a close, to the untranslated Polish of Szymborska that mysteriously suggests every beginning is a sequel or a continuation, to your amber ring, which is itself a sequel to another amber ring and a sequel to the sea that began as a forest. Even though people who are listening to this will be doing so after the book comes out, we're talking just days before the book comes out. And given that we are in the before the first book space, I can't not mention the Before the First Book Roundtable series you moderated at the Rumpus. 3 rounds of roundtables, each time with 3 different writers to discuss the time before the first book. So in that spirit of every beginning is a sequel, I'm going to ask you a couple of the questions you asked them before their first books. So here's the first question for you, composed by you. Is there an idea about being a writer/artist that you've let go of that you used to believe? Or an idea about being a writer/artist you've come to believe more strongly?
I should never ask questions that I haven't thought of answers to. Although I suppose I do think about this.
It's karma.
We do inherit so many ideas about what it means to write and make art and to be a person at all, don't we? I think I alluded earlier to the lie of writing as a solitary act that has been disproven at every step of the way in my journey in writing this book and as attempting to write at all. And so many people speak beautifully to the ways that writing is relational. And yet it is a time where I think we need to insist on that, where I need to remind myself in the times where it can feel really lonely or challenging or terrifying to write at all. I mean, there are such beautiful lines I think about Helen Sixu has that incredible book on 3 steps.
On the ladder of writing.
Yes, thank you. And you've interviewed her on this show twice, which is such a gift for anyone who has to listen to those conversations. There's that the ideas she has of like reading and writing themselves, where she says like the book is the door. I have it jotted down nearby. The book is the door, the dream of the other that doesn't escape us, that dreams us and waits for us. What is magnificent about books is that they can wait for us. And also says reading is eating the forbidden fruit, making forbidden love, and makes the connection between reading and writing. And it makes me think too of another book that was important for me, especially in thinking through that long, unwieldy, unbelonging poem in the book, was Dionne Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging, where she says writing is an act of desire, as is reading, and desire is also an act of reading, of translation. And all of this feels like a really important reminder for me of like the necessity. I guess it's the reinforced idea that we must read in order to write, but it's sort of subverting, thinking about the why a bit, about the desire as life force part of it, and the parts of it that make and unmake us. And so I think when I think about ideas I've let go of and returned to, they're kind of connected. Like I have to come back to the very basic facts of like, if I feel myself getting stuck, I simply need to open a book and read and re-enter this age-old conversation. But I also need to remember that like this is an act of desire, as Brand says, that this is part of it. This is not like that these things are so entangled, and that they're the gift of getting to write it all. And so I think sometimes, especially when one is in like a program and thinking about, it can become like this to-do list, and it's just, I'm really trying to come back to those foundational things about what brought me to language at all, and thinking about being really young and cracking open a book and going somewhere else entirely. And so that's been on my mind, about not forgetting what a portal reading is.
So another question for you from Patrycja. What is a creative dream that scares you?
Oh, so many. Writing this book scared me. Writing the next book scares me. I'm writing toward other books that really make me nervous to write, both toward a second poetry collection, sort of a novella. I used to sing a lot, and I've always been terrified of and desired making a record. Every creative act scares me to some degree, and also feels so magnetic to me. And I suppose that's the truth of that, being scared is part of it, and that I'm accepting that that's okay.
Let's stay with that fear for just one more beat before we hear a final poem, just to paint the landscape, at least how I imagine it for you. You're in your MFA right now. You're living in Wisconsin, which I should say, as an aside, has the highest percentage of Polish people in the United States. You're with a new cohort, a new community of writers, presumably all working alongside each other on writing new poetry. You're teaching poetry. You're having your poetry examined and assessed in a more intense way than probably before you came there. With that landscape in mind, you've mentioned some projects, and of course, venturing on new things, there's a certain amount of fear in the dream. But what qualities could you say about, say, the new poetry, the ones that have escaped the container of we contain landscapes, that are working in another way, whether the same questions or not? If they are different, what are some of the animating questions that are different, or what are some of the elements that aren't questions, that are formal or confessional or whatever, that make it scary?
one of the questions you asked me earlier that I struggled to answer candidly was orbiting the idea of the erotic and romance, and that is something that jokingly my thesis is jokingly titled romantic or pathetic, and it is
That's really good.
Maybe I'll keep it. And so I've been thinking about ages-old question of desire and love, and of course with some of the old questions from this first book that I'm still living into are there, but there are other layers of trying to risk even more mess and in this questioning and even more honesty. And then the other, you could say, formal factor that's influenced by the people here, by poets I've gotten to teach in prison with here, study alongside. I've been thinking a lot about the humor in the work of some amazing poets here, like Chessie Normile, who's going to read with me at my book launch, and in my cohort, Andrew Yim. Like, they're very funny poets, and they're influencing me a bit to access the part of me that is such a goofball and that has that impulse toward even that jokey second book title. And what does humor allow for? I'm really curious about. At the same time, I embrace and am here for the seriousness and heft and sadness. I think a lot of poets sometimes get, we'll come up to a podium and we'll sort of be like, well, sorry, we're going to bum out the crowd now. And I sort of own that. I'm here, like I say it in the book in many different ways, cry with me, let's do that. But at the same time, I am a person who loves to laugh. And so I've been thinking about what is humor as an invitation, as a form, and I'm influenced by some of the writers here in Madison that I've been reading the work of too.
Well, let's go out with a final poem. I was hoping we could end with Bury the Anchor.
Bury the Anchor, with an epigraph from Banu Kapil. How will you begin? Left foot into the stirrup, swing my right leg over. Larkspur, jonquil, rhododendron. Sing the second song that comes to mind. Slip the first into memory's crater. Beeswax, a pocket knife, kettle on low. Demand the fog tell how. Feel myself a stone at the bottom of a well. Know the sea. Rinse. It has to do with extremities. Throw open the curtains the way my mother did, perhaps her mother and mother before. Bury the anchor. Go to the lake. Arrange the fragments, shaping, dreaming.
Thank you, Patrycja, for spending the time together.
Thank you so much, David.
Been talking today to Patrycja Humienik about her debut collection, We Contain Landscapes. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Patrycja Humienik's work at patrycja-sarah.com, Patrycja Sarah.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter and help this quixotic endeavor go forward into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives supplementary resources with each and every conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during the conversation, and places to explore once you're done listening. And then there's a whirlwind of other things to choose from. You can subscribe to the bonus audio, which includes everything from a late-night whispered reading by Banu Kapil from her notebooks, to Denise Smith reading poetry from the fellow poets in their writing collective, and after each one, devising a poetry writing prompt for us. Or Tori Peters reading the first thing she wrote after transitioning, a zine called How to Become a Really, Really Not Famous Trans Lady Writer, which she reads for us in its entirety, all 20 steps. Also, a couple Polish-centric contributions, from Jay Chakrabarty reading 2 poems by the Polish poet Jerzy Fikowski, and Ayad Akhtar reading from the work of Polish theater director and theorist Jerzy Grotowski, one of his last published pieces, Performer. And the bonus audio is only one possible thing to choose from. If you join the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter, there's also, just to name a few, the Tin House Early Reader subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elisa Ogie in the book division, Bess Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her film at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.